Hello and welcome. I'm Valerie Paley, Senior Vice President, Chief Historian, and Director of the Center for Women's History at the New York Historical Society. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Louise Mirrer, our President and CEO, Pam Schaffler, Chair of the Board of Trustees, all of our trustees, Joyce B. Cowin, Diane Max, and the late Adam Max, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, along with our Chairman's Council, our members, and our many other generous donors. None of the work of New York Historical is possible without your continued and committed support. As many of you know, we launched the Center for Women's History in early 2017. It is the first initiative of its kind in the nation within the walls of a major museum. Now, even during this challenging time of the COVID-19 pandemic, we remain committed to exploring the lives and legacies of women who have shaped and continue to shape the American experience. Which brings me to today's historic keynote conversation, She Said and the World Listened, breaking news in the Me Too era. It is part of the 6th annual Diane and Adam E. Max Conference on Women's History, Breaking News, Breaking Barriers, Women in American Journalism. The format for this year's conference will be a little different, consisting of a series of conversations and panels, which we will air over the course of our related exhibition, Cover Story, Katharine Graham, CEO. I am delighted and honored to introduce today's extraordinary panel. Megan Twohey is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter with the New York Times and co-author of the book She Said, Breaking the Sexual Harassment Story that helped ignite a movement. The book takes readers behind the scenes of Twohey's and Jodi Kantor's 2017 investigation of Harvey Weinstein, which helped trigger the global reckoning on sexual misconduct. Along with a team of reporters who exposed sexual harassment and abuse across industries, she was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for public service in 2018. Twohey is a contributor to NBC and MSNBC. Our moderator, Irin Carmon, is a senior correspondent at New York Magazine, a CNN contributor, and co-author of Notorious RBG, The Life and Times of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which spent 3 months on the Times bestseller list. She's been a national reporter at MSNBC and NBC News, as well as a staff writer at Salon.com and Jezebel.com, covering gender, reproductive rights, and the law. As a contributing writer to the Washington Post's Outlook section, she won a 2018 Mirror Award from the Newhouse School at Syracuse University for her work breaking the story of sexual harassment allegations against Charlie Rose. She speaks frequently across the country on women's leadership and rights. In 2011, she was one of Forbes 30 Under 30 in media. Welcome, Megan and Irin.
Thank you so much, Valerie. Hi, Megan.
Hi.
So I wanted to start out by asking you, I've been following your career long before the Harvey Weinstein story, especially your investigation on the so-called rehoming of adopted children. The first question I wanted to ask you was, having reported as much as you did and as in-depth as you did on sexual assault issues, sexual harassment, famous people like the President Donald Trump, non-famous people like some of the most vulnerable people in the system, why do you think it was that the Harvey Weinstein story is the one that captured the international imagination the way that it did?
Mm-hmm. It's a really good question. And it was one of the reasons actually that Jodi Kantor, my reporting partner, and I actually decided to write a book about our investigation of Harvey Weinstein. Is even we were left wondering, why was this particular story, why did it resonate so much? Why did it really help break the dam and really cause such a flood of sexual harassment and other sexual assault allegations to come out into the world? And, one of the answers that we have come up with is, first of all, I do think that in 2016, the presidential race and the allegations against Donald Trump and the fact that he went on to be elected president did help set the stage, that there was in this country, you could see it in the women's marches, you could see it on social media, people who had already started to take to social media to share their own stories of abuse and harassment. I do think that there was this sort of bubbling outrage that was starting to kind of come up to the surface. And we found that in the course of our reporting when trying to find the women who had allegedly been victimized by Harvey Weinstein. we heard from some of those women that they were, had been sitting on these really painful secrets for so many years, but in the Trump presidency had been galvanized by a desire to do something. And there were already some examples of how coming forward and speaking out could make a difference. For example, the stories about Bill O'Reilly that broke in the spring of 2017, I think were really instructive, and that the culture might be changing. I mean, Bill O'Reilly and Fox News had settled, had ultimately paid out tens of millions of dollars to silence women who had come forward with allegations of sexual misconduct against him. And when the New York Times published those allegations and the way they'd been covered up, the impact was almost immediate. He was forced out of Fox News. One of the most powerful figures in conservative media was forced to step down. So that was really a moment at the Times where we started to think, are there other, it seems like a quaint question now, but are there other powerful men who have abused women and tried to cover it up? And so that was sort of the setting in which we started the Weinstein investigation. Now, why did it resonate so much? I think one of the reasons was this was one of the first stories you had in which some of the women who came forward were more powerful and more visible than the accused. And so I think while there had been many stories, I myself had spent years covering them, of women who have been, and others, women, men, who had been victims of sexual harassment and sexual assault and sexual abuse, that seeing these familiar faces, these people that we knew from television, from movies, who felt like they'd been in our homes, and this sense that if it's happened to them, then really nobody's safe. And if they are speaking out, and if they are standing up and trying to do something about this, maybe there is really finally a change that can happen around these issues.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. As I was watching it happen, I thought, wow, this is incredible reporting. And wow, people are talking about this. And wow, they're talking about it the next day and the next day and the next day. And having seen a lot of really brilliantly reported pieces come and then the conversation move on, I just thought I had never in my life, after also reporting on a lot of these issues, seen anything with that kind of staying power. And you're right, the kind of emotional relationship that Americans have with celebrities, right? And I just remember when you guys got Gwyneth Paltrow, Angelina Jolie to go on the record, the same stereotypes that get levied at women who come forward, that they're trying to get rich, that it's revenge, name your stereotype, cannot be levied against these women who are just superstars in the stratosphere. Right?
That's exactly right, especially in those numbers. And looking back, it's pretty remarkable to realize that, at least in our first story in October of 2017, there was one actress on the record, Ashley Judd, was the only actress who went on the record. There was a woman, a really brave source, Laura Madden, who had been an assistant, who had worked as a junior employee in one of Weinstein's companies, in Miramax. And she too went on the record in that first story. But it was, by that point, we had realized there were sort of two categories of victims. There were the young women who had worked for him, who had gone, it was often their first job out of college as they were trying to break into the entertainment industry. They were told, you go to work for Harvey Weinstein, it's going to be, your gateway in, and you'll be able to ride that ticket into higher positions, even if he's notoriously difficult to work for. And then there were the women who acted in his films. So he was basically serving as a boss to both, and holding a lot of power over both of those kind of different categories of women. But in the course of our investigation, we had really pursued women in both of those categories, not only trying to collect their accounts, but trying to convince them to go on the record. And in our first story, there were only two who went on the record. And we had a lot of other information that we were able to report, a lot of other allegations and evidence of wrongdoing.
Documents, settlements.
Documents, exactly, yeah. Proof of the secret settlements, like the ones that Bill O'Reilly and Fox had paid out. But, that was a huge ask for those first two women. And I think sometimes it can be forgotten because within a matter of days, there were dozens of women who came forward and shared their stories. And obviously, Ronan Farrow had, his really powerful story teed up that published soon after ours in the New Yorker. And then, you know, we also had that follow-up story with Gwyneth and Angelina and some of those other folks. But I think that it wasn't just that it wasn't just sort of who some of these women were that were coming forward. It was the sheer number of them. It became, you couldn't ignore the fact that quickly the number climbed from, you know, one actress to dozens of actresses and dozens more women who had been within his orbit. And so I think that was also something that just was so hard. You know, there wasn't a consensus of whether or not people weren't battling to, you know, people weren't disagreeing over, did this powerful producer do something wrong? At that point, the mountain of evidence was just so massive that you couldn't refute that. Nobody, even his staunchest defenders, right? Even the David Boyses and the Lisa Blooms and the people who had been these interesting figures who had been by his side, even the people within the, you know, the board of his company, for example, there was nobody who was trying to make the case for Harvey Weinstein, you know, within that sort of first couple of weeks after the stories broke.
And then there were, of course, stories that built on the momentum, you know, not just stories about Harvey Weinstein. And I consider myself also a beneficiary in a way as a journalist from the reporting that you guys did, because in 2010, I had learned about allegations against Charlie Rose, and I had tried to report on them. And some of them were very fresh, like weeks old. And those individuals were not ready to speak. And then once the reporting on Harvey Weinstein, yours and Jodi's reporting, and then Ronan's reporting came out, and I think people started to see, wow, these are being taken seriously. Roy Moore, allegations against Roy Moore that ran in the Washington Post. And so suddenly picking up the phone and calling people, they could also, I think that there was also an institutional shift though. And I'm curious what you think of this, because at the time, you know, in 2010, I worked at Jezebel, and I didn't really have the tools even to see it through, but also the world, you know, I don't know that there was a category at newspapers the way that we now as journalists can say, you know, and I think you guys really pioneered this, can say, okay, where are the documents about settlements? You know, did she tell several friends? You know, is there a paper trail? Is she willing to go on the record? How many people do we think should go on the record? So I just, as an observation and as a thank you, you know, a lot of other people felt like they could then go on the record, share their sources, you know, even speak at first off on the record and then gradually get there because of the work that you guys did. How did you figure out, you know, in this category of story that almost didn't exist so much before? I mean, you mentioned Bill O'Reilly, but it was not a genre the way it is now.
Right.
How did you build those building blocks? And did you have to kind of work to get that institutional support to say, actually, this is not just a personal matter. This is a story that's worthy of, you know, serious investigative chops?
Mm-hmm. It's a really good question. And as a reporter who had done these type of stories for many years, often reporting, I mean, I had done stories on sexual harassment and sex crimes when I was a reporter at the Chicago Tribune, and, you know, women on the south side of Chicago who were being victimized by their doctor, and people who were seeing their rape kits shelved. I was one of the first reporters to look into that issue. And so I had experience doing sex crimes reporting and having an impact in terms of writing about people who subsequently went to jail or getting state laws changed, for example. But in terms of, so I knew I came in with a lot of experience on what components were necessary to basically write a story that was going to stick. And so I knew, and I had relied in large part on police reports and other public documents that you could ultimately get your hands on as a reporter, which, you know, once in print can be hard to refute. And also the value of corroboration, right? So even if there's not documents, if you're talking to a victim and they're sharing their account of what's happened, your first question, you know, did you ever report this in a way that was documented? If so, how can we get those records? Second question being, okay, even if you didn't do that, did you tell anybody at the time? Did you tell family members? Did you tell friends? If so, I'd like to talk to those people, because that can help corroborate your story if they're backing up. Yes, I remember, you know, she showed up at my door distraught, you know, after this particular attack and told me exactly what had happened. And so I had seen what components had been sort of had given stories legs, stories about sex crimes and sexual harassment in the past. But it was another thing to kind of take it onto the national, or even ultimately, Me Too was the international stage. And you know, to go back to this really remarkable moment at the New York Times in 2017, I had been part of the, you know, Michael Barbaro and I had done the stories about Trump's treatment of women and had worked with women who had come forward with allegations of sexual harassment and assault against him. And that was really a moment where we at the Times were starting to, in some ways, institutionalize the way we did those stories, you know, really relying on corroborators if there weren't documents. You know, you said that you were sexually assaulted by Donald Trump on an airplane in the 1980s. You know, did you tell anybody? If so, who were those people, and tracking those people down and talking to them. So when those women went on the record, they were going on the record with corroborators and also with other women. I mean, we didn't do a story with one woman coming forward with an allegation against Donald Trump. We did stories with multiple women coming forward. So then, you know, so we were doing that in 2016. Bill O'Reilly happens in 2017. And that was really a moment where the institution of the New York Times said, okay, I think that this is something that we as an entire news organization should make a commitment to. Let's get, you know, editors and reporters together and basically come up with a sexual harassment investigative project in which we are looking not only at people like Harvey Weinstein, we're looking into academia, we're looking into, you know, the blue collar workplace, we're looking into the Silicon Valley. And so that was also the moment where you had basically a growing kind of structure within our newsroom in which we were, as reporters and editors, sharing strategies for how we were going to do these stories. You know, Emily Steele, who was one of the reporters who broke the Bill O'Reilly story, you know, would come basically have one-on-one sessions with me and Jodi, in which she would give us tips on how she had pursued some of the women who were locked into secret settlements with him and how she was able to report out those secret settlements. So over the course of those many months, we basically were building up an internal playbook. And once the Weinstein story broke and the world really responded, and the Me Too movement, which had already been in existence before, but really kind of took off, you know, like wildfire, we were actually getting, it became like a group project, sexual harassment coverage, not just within the New York Times, but across these many news organizations. So I don't know what your experience has been. I mean, you know, if you ended up consulting with reporters and I know that you guys were working in conjunction a little bit with the Washington Post at one point, but we were getting calls from reporters and other news organizations saying, I've got a tip about this figure in my city or in my town. You know, do you have any advice on how we might be able to pursue it? And so it was incredible to watch this become something that was adopted by, you know, news organization after media organization, like not just across the country, but ultimately around the world. And it's still happening. I mean, you know, I think this is now an established, you know, path of reporting and playbook for reporting.
How do you juggle the fact that being a reporter requires being aggressive? Pursuing was a word that you use. These are normal behaviors for a reporter, to be tough, to try to nail down someone's details, to cross-examine them almost. How do you juggle that with the fact that in many cases, these are vulnerable people? The experience they had might have completely set them adrift. You know, they may not live perfect lives. They maybe have very good reason not to want to come forward. You don't want to re-traumatize them if you think they're credible, right? How do you balance that?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I'd ask you the same question. It's a really tough balancing act, right? To, you know, when you are pursuing these type of stories, you are often, you know, picking up the phone or knocking on a door, and the person on the other end, asking that person on the other end to discuss what may very well be the most painful experience of their life. And there's so many reasons not to talk to a reporter and not to go on the record. As you know, especially with victims of sexual harassment and sexual abuse, they often feel like there can be feelings of shame and, you know, sort of mistakenly feeling like you're somehow to blame for what's happened, and a fear that you are going to be the one to suffer damage to your reputation, to your career, if you speak out. And so oftentimes, so you have to figure out what as a reporter, you have to kind of figure out how you're going to try to convince somebody that it's worth making this leap. It's worth going on the record. It's worth it's worth putting yourself in such a vulnerable position. And one of the things that I have found time and time again that has, the case that I have made is to say, listen, I can't change what's happened to you, but if you work with us, we might be able to put your private pain to public use. We might be able to protect other people from getting hurt. And I have found that especially, and maybe it's especially with women, I don't know if this is the case sometimes with men, but especially with women, I found that that feeling that they might be able to help or protect other women can sometimes motivate to do things that they would otherwise not want to do. But in the case of Weinstein, many of the women that we were trying to get in touch with or trying to get to share their stories with us were legally prohibited from doing that because they had entered into these secret settlements, which are, these out of court secret settlements that have been used by many predators to cover their tracks. And, I remember one day knocking on the door, there was a woman who had worked in one of Harvey at Miramax, Weinstein's first company. And we had heard that we had reason to believe that she had been victimized by him when she was a young, working as a junior employee there in her early 20s. And she had disappeared from the company and she had basically never been heard from again. But there was some of the people who former employees thought that had reason to believe that maybe something, not just that something had happened to her, but maybe she had ended up being silenced through a settlement. So I've been trying to track her down and eventually I found her place of work. I was leaving her messages. She wasn't responding. Eventually I found a family member of hers who was living in the New York area. And I drove out to this house in the suburbs of New York with a handwritten note saying, making the case for explaining more about who Jodi and I were and why we're doing this investigation. And I thought this family member can hopefully pass this along to the woman that I'm trying to track down. And when I got there, it was actually the woman herself who answered the door. And she said, I can't believe, she said, I've been waiting for this knock on my door for 25 years.
Wow.
I can't believe you found me. And at the same time, she was terrified to speak to me. And so that was, that's a real balancing act for a reporter, because you don't want to do something that's going to actually hurt somebody, hurt somebody.
Yeah, I think it's a tough call. I've shown up at the houses of people who were witnesses and enablers, but I think, to be honest, I think I would find it really hard to show up at a house of someone who I thought was victimized. And that's the thing that a reporter is supposed to do. But I struggle with that because I do think, obviously she was happy to see you in the end. It was the right thing. You guys were good reporters. But I think it's genuinely tough with sexual assault and harassment stories in a way it's not with others. And I respect people who do that. I'm not sure that I can do it.
Well, and then there's the other beat to that, which is when you do form a close source relationship with somebody who's been a victim of sexual harassment and sexual assault, or sexual assault, it's clear, listen, we wouldn't be doing this report, you and I wouldn't be doing this reporting if we didn't care deeply about these issues.
Yeah.
But then and when you get into a close relationship with a source, there are also those moments where you have to make clear
that you're not their friend, you're not their therapist.
I'm not your friend. I'm not your therapist. I'm not your advocate. And I don't know if you've had this experience, but sometimes, especially if you are one of the few people that they've confided in about this, they also want to start asking you, I don't know if you've been in a situation where somebody's asking you for advice, what should I do here?
Yeah.
What would you do if you were me? And I try pretty early on in the process and throughout to say, I want to be clear, what I'm doing is journalism. I can't tell you what to do. And that, it's a big distinction. Jodi and I make a huge effort.
And that you have to tell them that you can't predict what the outcome would be, because I've also been asked a lot, will this person get fired? Or what do you think will happen to him? And not only can I not predict the future, I cannot appear to put my thumb on the scale to say, if you do this, there will be this result.
Yeah.
Or I will help you get to this result. I think the the part that I have figured out about, the follow-up and the trend, the relationship with the, the source balanced with the sort of requirements of reporting. Some people, I think, now have realized that if they subject themselves to the difficult processes of like, who did you tell? Why didn't you report it? Did you ever send a friendly email, for example? Did you ever, was there ever any consensual contact? The kinds of questions that if you were that person's friend, you might not ask them, but you're not their friend. But understanding now, and this was to me a very intense experience, because these are, even if you're not their friend or your therapist, you develop very intense source relationships with them. But to protect them, that those rules are there to preempt when the piece comes out, somebody brandishing a bunch of emails. For example, in the Charlie Rose story, we had, somebody turned over a bunch of emails that she had written that she described them as sycophantic and positive. In the Harvey Weinstein case, of course, we talked about this earlier today. Some of the individuals who later ended up being in the criminal case had also had consensual relationships with him in addition to being sexually assaulted. So I hope that one of the things that we learned from the reporting, and that individuals who may come forward with allegations might have learned, is that the rigors of reporting actually protect them by showing that we aren't kind of showing a skewed view of what happened, and that we understand these kinds of complexities.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, that's sort of also the sort of third pillar, right? Crucial third pillar of the reporter source relationship, especially in these stories, is that not only are you making clear that you're not, their friend or their therapist, not only are you trying to do that balancing act of trying to make the case that going on the record and being part of your story can potentially make a difference without making any promises, but you are also then asking all of those tough questions. And these can be awkward conversations where you're saying, and I remember doing this with women who came forward with allegations against Trump, who were debating whether or not to go on the record, and also with, women who went on the record with Weinstein. But are those questions, those crucial questions, is there anything from your background that he may try to use against you? Is there, was there friendly communication after the fact?
Right.
Do you have an ex-boyfriend who's going to come out of the woodwork and make any claims against you? Mm-hmm. And listen, it's not, and I'm asking you this, I'm not saying it necessarily has to go in the story, but we just need to make sure that I don't have any blind spots, and that we're going into the story with making sure that you use the language, and it's exactly right, protecting you. And then we're also protecting, the New York Times and us as reporters. It's really important that when we put forward stories that we're doing so with as much integrity as possible, and, having done as much due diligence as possible.
In our last few minutes, I want to ask you, what was the experience for you as a human being and as a reporter to be marinating in this really traumatic material in many cases? And you're juggling it with living a regular life where you might want to go home and watch a show on Netflix someday, time willing. Mm-hmm. How did it change you as a person, and how did it change you as a reporter?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good question. I think you've talked about, I think you've got an 8-month-old at home with you right now.
Correct.
Pandemic baby.
Yes.
I started the Weinstein investigation my first day back from maternity leave. So I had a 4-month-old daughter at the time.
I cannot imagine. Wow.
And it was tough. I'll be honest. It was tough for me. It was the first moment I was handing her off to, a very valued another caretaker. And I was really nervous about the whole process of going back to work and what that was going to mean. And I remember talking to, and so in some ways, this daughter made me wonder if I was going to be able to kind of do my job as an investigative journalist and do it as well as I had when I'd been able to work all, around the clock, day in and day out, before becoming a mother. But she also served as huge motivation. I remember she was 4, so obviously she was not talking and presumably had no idea what I was saying, but I still sat down and had this conversation with her before going back to work and saying, Mom is working on this. And Jodi had already been in contact with me about the story while I was on maternity leave. So in some ways I had already started it, but sitting her down and saying, I am working on this story with the hopes that it's going to make the world a safer place for you girls, from your generation. And, I'm going to ask you to do your part here. Like, you got to be good while I'm away at work. And it was, and so while and as you know, it can be difficult to juggle work with sort of being a mother of a newborn and a mother of a baby. But for me, it was also served as inspiration. And I just felt like I had been doing this work for so long, but doing this work with a young daughter, kind of brought the sense of purpose to another level. She still doesn't know who Harvey, when she's about to turn 4, she still doesn't know who Harvey Weinstein is. But that is the hope, right? That is the hope that when she's going into the workplace in 20 years, that it's going to be safer than it was 5 years ago when, you and I and so many other journalists were, first starting to tackle these important subjects through journalism.
I think it will be. And we know for sure that she'll be really, really proud of her mother.
Yeah. And
be able to say that she was a newborn when her mother was changing the world.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Megan. This has been such a treat. I really appreciate it.
Oh my goodness, it was my pleasure. I wish we could talk. I wish we could. I miss seeing people like you and in person. It's really so special to be able to come together, even if it's only virtually for the time being.
Thank you. I want to thank Megan Twohey and Irin Carmon for being with us today. Our Max Conference series, Breaking News, Breaking Barriers, Women in American Journalism, will continue throughout Women's History Month and beyond. Please sign up for our mailing list and follow us at nyhistory.org to get the latest on the series. And finally, we hope to see you back on Central Park West to view cover story Katharine Graham, CEO, opening on May 21st in our Joyce B. Cowin Women's History Gallery. Until then, thank you.